So, finally, we have the long overdue Chrontendo episode 26, featuring part 2 of the great 1987 RPG Showdown. In Chron Sega 4, we saw Phantasy Star. We now take a look at Final Fantasy, almost certainly the best remembered NES RPG, at least outside of Japan. But there's more. Capcom steps into the console arena with Mega Man, Data East finally makes a good game, and we have an oddball RPG from Nintendo and a port of an old American RPG. This episode probably doesn't really need any bonus content, but here it is, a look at the top 100 games of all time, as voted by the readers of Famitsu. So, let's get started. Let's begin with an adventure title. Yamamura Misa Suspense, Kyouto Ryo no Tera Satsujin Jiken from Taito. Taito recently put out their first RPG, and now they try their hand at the adventure game genre. At this stage, Taito is still outsourcing all of his original Famicom games, so this one is developed by Tosa. You know, this is actually a pretty quality intro here. It's unusually cinematic, almost Ninja Gaiden-esque. Tosa has really been steadily improving the quality of their output. The character portraits in this game are quite nice, and a hell of a lot better looking than their earlier games, like Kinnikuman, for example. Alright, so we're in Kyoto checking out the cherry blossoms or whatever, and then a body. Will you be able to find the killer? Sure, by using all the little options in your toolbar. You can walk, listen, look, pick up, all the skills a detective needs. Yamamura Misa Suspense uses a rather unique looking series of icons on the action bar. The ears actually talk, not listen, by the way. Wonder why they didn't use a mouth. Well, I guess the other people actually do all the talking. So as usual, you talk to the people involved and look for clues. Doesn't really seem too far out of the ordinary. So what's with the title? Yamamura Misa is a popular Japanese mystery writer. I believe she was involved in Japanese television series as well. There were a few other Yamamura Misa Suspense games, but the series quickly jumped from Taito to other labels. The last one was a 3DO game, oddly enough. Well, this is all very interesting, but I guess not too terribly spectacular. I guess it's nice that Taito is sort of stretching out a bit, but it is a bit of a slow start this episode, and we've got some other weird titles coming up as well. Hey, it's another game in Namco's Family Sports series. Last time we saw one of these was way back in August, Family Mahjong, I believe. There were 2 Family Sports games in December. First up is Family Tennis. We'll see the other one next time. Well, it's a tennis game, that much is clear. Like the Famicom golf games we've been seeing, there are multiple play options. Exhibition is like a one-off game, whereas Tournament and World Tour are, tournament games where you need to face off against a whole series of players. It's funny, all these seem to be based on real tennis players. I'll take McEnroe, I guess. Tennis racket flinging not included. Is there any difference between the players? I'm not sure. You also get to choose the tournament that you want to play. Great rendition of God Save the Queen here. Nothing else in this game has decent production values. So this is the second Famicom tennis game, and in gameplay terms, not much has really changed. But I mean, how could it really? Tennis is the simplest video game possible. Move your player, hit a button, swing the racket. Also in this case, the D-pad controls the direction of the shot. The camera does move around pretty freely depending on where your ball is headed. I know I'm terrible at this game, but is playing against the computer really this hard? It seems impossible to reach his serves each time. And it's quite easy to get a fault while serving. I've actually lost a few points, strictly from faults. Now when playing the exhibition mode, you have a few different options, like what kind of court you're playing on. And here, of course, is the ridiculously silly Cosmo mode. You're actually playing tennis in space. As I was saying, tennis games are pretty basic gameplay-wise. There's really not that much Namco can do with the idea of hitting a ball back and forth. It's not really much different than that old Atari 2600 tennis game. As for how it handles, well, it's kind of hard to say. I'm not really good enough to judge, but the CPU opponents completely whip me every time. In 2-player mode, this is not going to be a problem. Obviously, modern-day tennis games have all kinds of crazy control options, but none of that's on display here. So if you're looking for just a basic hit the ball back and forth tennis game, go ahead and give this one a shot. Ooh, I made a funny. One of the weirder games we've seen was the Santa Claus no Takaro Bako for the FDS. Part of the game was simply these weird gaming results generators. It produced like random bingo numbers and whatnot. Well, how would you like another one? From Sofel we have Gokuraku Yuugi, Game Tengoku, or Game Heaven, a name that rather oversells the game. There are a number of different options available, some of which are quite similar to the Santa Claus game. For example, once again there's the bingo number generator. Cute graphics, however, and I like the way that you can hit the chicken repeatedly to change the numbers. Also, we have this weird blackjack style game involving people on a little roller coaster. Then there's the old favorite, random dice throws. There are some other things, some of which actually resemble real games. There's like sort of like a slot machines thing, poker, where both hands are visible for some reason, and a memory solitaire game. So this is just sort of another quickie FDS disc. I've stated before that the Famicom disk system is quickly becoming a repository for cheapo games. There will of course still be some decent titles coming out from time to time, but it's worth noting that all the big games of December 1997 were on cartridges. So Game Tengoku was a little odd, and continuing in a similar vein, it's Tetsudou O, Railroad King, and the subtitle of this game is actually Famicom Board Game. Railroad-based games were quite popular in Japan. Recall that Hudson's Momotaro Densetsu game. There was a popular spin-off of that. It was a railroad-themed game called Momotaro Dentetsu. Sounds bizarre, I know. Well, Tetsudou O is one of those sorts of games. Now, it's not the first Japanese rail game. That honor might go to A Resha de Iko, aka Take the A Train, a very early railroad simulation game from 1986. The series is quite popular in Japan and still around today. However, Tetsudou O also combines that with the game of life. You know, the board game where you travel around, get a job, make money, etc. Video games based on the game of life were not uncommon in Japan, and we'll undoubtedly see more of them in the future. So how do you play this game? Well, as you can see, the layout does resemble a board game. There's a very sort of train tracks going everywhere. You spin the spinner and move around on the board, and then various sorts of lucky or unlucky events occur. For example, maybe like a fire or something. Yep, house burned down. And of course, you know, there's lucky things that can happen to you as well, like, for example, sometimes you make money. One way of making money is by betting on horses. Yep, there is a horse racing mini-game in here. Now, the developer of this title is DB Soft, who we've also seen games like Flappy, Woody Poco, Galg, and a few others. This is actually their last Famicom game. I've never really understood video games based on sort of regular games that you can just play with a board or with a deck of cards or something, but they're quite popular in both Japan and the US, and this is, I suppose, our official welcome to the Japanese board game genre. Holy cow, Nintendo finally goes RPG. Sort of, as we'll see. This is Ginga no Sannin, which means something like Galaxy Trio. While Nintendo obviously made its name with platformer, action, venture, and sports titles, they've been branching out to other genres in the last few months. We've seen them take on adventure games and dating sims, and now we have the first Nintendo-published RPG for the system. But this has sort of an odd history. Oh yeah, there's the typical sci-fi plot here, mankind attacked by mysterious alien forces. So, the strange thing about Ginga no Sannin is it's actually a port of a computer game from 1985. And the original title of this was Chikyo Senshi Raiza, or Earth Fighter Raiza, originally released for the FM7 computer. This version is for the PC-88, and it's pretty much identical. But the game was originally from Enix, as you can see there on the title screen. It features turn-based space battles involving mechs and robots and that sort of thing. It looks very similar to Cruise Chaser Blasty, which was Square's first RPG, which was also on the PC-88. Just like that game, actually playing it is sort of an arduous process. There's lots of menus, and it is kind of slow-moving. I'm not sure how or why Nintendo decided to acquire the rights for a Famicom port, or why they decided to completely change the name. Maybe they didn't want consumers to know this was a 2-year-old game? Well, regardless of the original vintage, Ginga has been given a post-Dragon Quest makeover, with the familiar little boxes and options and menus and whatnot. Now, one unusual thing about Ginga is that it is once again a Japanese game in which was seemingly borrowed from Star Raiders. You have the typical galaxy map with enemies, bases, and planets. You travel around the galaxy and you progress bit by bit, sort of space by space, with a chance of a random battle at every stop along the path. Oh yeah, and of course the other character, the male character, must be about the most douchebaggy looking guy ever seen in any video game so far. Now when you reach a planet you'll find these side views, sort of almost like dungeon sections here. You sort of cruise along looking for power-ups and helpful items, and there'll be some enemies in some of the dungeons. On the map screen you'll also find bases, and traveling to those will replenish your hit points. Ginga no Sannin goes a little bit overboard with the enemies. You can face up to 9 enemies at once. They'll always have the same kind, and your attacks will hit all the enemies. I'm not really sure what happens later in the game, but it seems that once you've traveled all over and explored the solar system, you'll find warps to other parts of the galaxies. Eventually, you'll even obtain a third party member. A little girl who naturally has ESP powers, like all little girls in video games seem to do. Several large bosses are found on each level. I'm coming up to one now. Now, aside from your lasers, you have a limited number of missiles, and they're pretty powerful and helpful against the bosses. And you can actually choose how many to fire at once from the menu. Though when you're shooting them, it looks more like you're throwing rocks at the boss, rather than firing missiles. Here we go. Unfortunately, I hadn't been conserving my missiles. I suppose Ginga would be one of those sort of lesser-known Famicom releases from Nintendo. It's interesting that Nintendo seems to be deliberately developing games in 2 categories. Those that have intended international releases, and those that are only for Japan. As for this game not being released over here, well, it's probably not a huge loss, as Ginga seems to be too repetitive, even in comparison to other RPGs, and the fact that you have to use a menu command to move is quite irritating. Interesting looking title, though Nintendo would later go on to put their names on better RPGs such as the Mother games. The most notable thing is that the characters were designed by Japanese cartoonist Go Nagai, and the music was actually done by Yukihiro Takahashi from Yellow Magic Orchestra. Too bad that talent wasn't used in a more interesting game. Konami is winding down its exciting sports series. Exciting Boxing is, I believe, the second to last game. Konami has been putting these things out quite quickly. The first one, Exciting Billiard, came out in June. Typically, the intro has great music. So, a Konami boxing game sounds like a good idea. After all, Exciting Basket was excellent, but this isn't quite the game you hope it's going to be. You see, rather than using punch-out style controls, Exciting Boxing actually came with an inflatable punching bag boxer. You can see it a little bit on the box art, and here's an ad that gives you an idea. Sorry I couldn't come up with a better picture, but I think it sort of gives you the general idea of what it actually looks like. So this thing had sensors in it that picked up where you hit it. There's different sorts of punches, high, low, jabs, hooks. The training session will help your boxer build up his strength and speed. Now the game is a series of fights, 7 in total, 1 for each weight class. Rather than working your way up to the championship in your own weight class, as in Boxing, you fight the champion of each different class. Thus apparently you end up holding the titles for every single weight class, becoming the all-time grand boxing champion. You play simply by hitting the bag. I'm not sure how responsive the thing was in real life, but the controls have been emulated so you can play it here today. You may have to knock down the guy more than once before he stays out. Oh yeah, and his mouthpiece always goes flying whenever you knock him out. Konami seems interested in coming up with weird controllers to their games, Do-Re-Miko being another example. Remember, of course, these are the guys who later came out with DDR and Beatmania. Still, as interesting as this is, I think I would actually like to see a more traditional boxing game from Konami. Exciting boxing certainly sounds a little gimmicky, and who knows how well the bag actually hold up. I can't imagine there are too many of these things still floating around in perfect condition. Okay, so forget all that other crap this episode. December 17th sees our first great game, Capcom's Rockman. The Rockman series eventually became very successful, and dozens of games have been released, though outside of Japan, we know this game under the name Mega Man. We obviously got the worst title screen. Mega Man is an action platformer, but a very unique one. Right from the get-go, we can choose which order we play the levels. That's right, the first 6 levels can be played or replayed in any order. So we'll start with Gutsman, which is sort of now the traditional first level to take. Mega Man's non-linearity is one defining feature of the game. The other, of course, is the utter difficulty. Within 10 seconds of Gutman's level, you encounter some very tricky jumping. Yes, well-timed and controlled jumps are frequently necessary in this game. Who knows how many kids accustomed to Super Mario freaked out when they encountered that very first sequence there on the moving platforms. It might not be clear to all those who haven't played Mega Man, but your margin of error in timing the jumps is often very small. It's quite easy to jump a split second too early or late and plummet to your death. Plummeting to your death is what we might call sort of a recurring theme in Mega Man. So once you reach the end of each level, you're locked in a room and need to battle one of the 6 robot masters. Here's Gutsman himself, known for his ability to throw enormous rocks at you. One nice touch, all the bosses have visible life meters. Now, so far this is not much different than Castlevania, or most of the other platformers we've seen so far, but here's the catch. After defeating a boss, you'll get his special weapon. With Gutsman, for example, you'll receive his arm that allows you to throw movable blocks. Thus, much like Metroid, you'll gradually increase your arsenal as you play through the game. Now, it should be clear that Mega Man was intended to be a pretty special game, and it was released in Japan and the US almost simultaneously. The US release was somewhat botched, however, as it features some of the worst box art in the history of the console. While the Japanese cart got a standard anime-styled art of Rockman, in the US we got this guy. I actually wish I knew the story behind the creation of that particular cover art, since it became so notorious for being very ugly and not really looking like anything in the game itself. The terrible cover art is kind of a shame because Mega Man is what you would call a labor of love. It was the brainchild of artist Keiji Inafune, creator and game designer Akira Kitamura, and producer Tokuro Fujiwara, who might be considered to be sort of like the Shigeru Miyamoto of Capcom. His other credits include Ghost and Goblins, Bionic Commando, the original Commando, Resident Evil, and many more games. The name Rockman refers to rock and roll. Rock's robot sister is called Roll, and musical references are found all throughout the series. In the US, the name was changed, perhaps because Capcom USA thought it would sound weird to American kids, or possibly due to the name already being used by the legendary portable music amplifier designed by Tom Schultz. Supposedly Rainbow Man was one of the names considered before Mega Man was finally settled upon. Mega Man's creators had a bit of a mean streak, which coupled with the game's innovative platforming, made it one of the toughest for the NES. For example, here's the first of several disappearing block sequences. You have to know exactly when and where the next block will appear, since the block you're standing on will usually disappear before the next block appears. That is, you'll already need to be in mid-jump when the next block appears. These ridiculous things, known as Big Eyes, do major damage if they touch you. They either jump high or low randomly, so you need to sort of run under them very quickly when the opportunity arises. Each level has a theme, by the way, based on the boss of that particular level. Now here's the thing, each boss is weak to a certain other boss's weapon. Iceman, for example, who we saw just a second ago, will take big damage from Electroman's Thunder Beam. So tackling Electroman first will make Iceman a lot easier. You can then use Iceman's Ice Slasher to take on Fireman and so on. And the special weapons are helpful during the actual levels themselves. As we saw a second ago, the Jets of Flame can be frozen, then jumped on using the Ice Slasher. This gives the game sort of like a Metroid feel. Now, Mega Man has a very generous health meter, and you can take quite a few hits, but that won't help you against frequently falling to your death. Aside from just plain difficult jumps, there's a possibility of getting sort of hit by a projectile or enemy while jumping, which will often cause you to lose a life. Additionally, Mega Man, like Simon Belmont, does get pushed back a bit when he's hit. This will cause you to fall off a ledge. Mega Man has no save game feature or password, so it needs to be played all in one sitting, which can be a bit much. A lot of practice is required to complete this game. Now, once you've defeated all the 6 robot monsters, we'll be on the final level here. The level of the evil Dr. Wily. You saw the smug bastard flying in his flying saucer just a moment ago. The first 6 levels are really just a warm-up for the very lengthy and difficult final Dr. Wily level. Now, Capcom really ramped up the platforming elements of this game. No other Famicom game other than maybe the Japanese Super Mario 2 required so much careful or lucky jumping. It should be noted the controls on this game are very tight and very precise. Now, aside from the disappearing blocks, maybe the most infamous part of Mega Man is this guy, the Yellow Devil or the Rock Monster, far and away the toughest boss in the game. He breaks himself into 19 pieces which come flying across the screen at you. You didn't have time to get exactly one hit in with a Thunder Beam, and then he comes again. You need to memorize the pattern of the pieces and execute a series of perfectly timed jumps to avoid getting hit. Each block does huge damage, so you can't make more than a couple mistakes. The battle is quite nerve-wracking, but there is a cheat that makes things easier. Pausing and unpausing the game at the right time will cause him to take multiple hits as your lightning passes through. But still, the first time you fight this guy, he seems literally impossible, and it takes a lot of practice to avoid the blocks. I'm sure tons of Nintendo controllers were thrown out the window the first time this guy was encountered. And if that weren't bad enough, you didn't need to rebattle all the Robot Masters a second time. You now have all the weapons, which is helpful, but you will have to defeat 4 of them back-to-back with no health refills, and that can be a bit trying. So Mega Man, I guess, is a very early example of what we call a boss rush. Oddly, it turns out Final Fantasy does the same thing. You have to refight all the bosses in the last level. Now, on top of all this, there's 2 other boss fights, one against some flying bubble robots, and the other one against a clone of Mega Man himself. And the thing is, whenever you switch to a special weapon, so does your clone, so this can actually be a tough fight. You have to sort of use the regular blaster most of the time. Eventually you'll get all the way through Dr. Wily's Robot Factory, and then you're in the home stretch. And while the very final area is lacking on health refills, at least it does give you one last final weapons refill. Each of the special weapons, by the way, has a limited number of shots, and so they must be refilled, just like your health. As it turns out, Dr. Wily is not too difficult himself, not nearly like the Rock Monster. Well, the story behind this game is actually quite well known. Mega Man supposedly didn't sell too well, but maybe this was due to lack of promotion on Capcom's part. Apparently, Capcom didn't have much interest in the game. Looking back now, you really sort of have to wonder what Capcom was thinking. Mega Man was far and away the best Famicom game they produced at the time. Prior to this, everything they put out for the system was based on an arcade game, other than a few marginal titles like that Mahjong game. But Capcom's status as a great publisher of console games really begins right here with Mega Man. Looking back now, it's clear that Mega Man is a major turning point, both for Capcom and for platform games in general. Having played a lot of these earlier Famicom post-Mario platformers, a lot of them really are quite dull and repetitive, and really not that exciting. I mean, sure, you have to sort of jump around and climb ladders and stuff, but it's really not that interesting. With Mega Man, every level is different and unique, and you're always kept on your toes. You really have no idea what's coming up next. Aside from the stuff like the disappearing blocks, at some points you actually have to use the magnetic beam in order to create your own platforms. The game gives the player some discretion as to how they want to play it. For example, if you do some of the other levels first and get the magnetic beam, it makes that jumping sequence in the first part of Gutsman's level much easier. So Mega Man did completely raise the bar for platforming games. Well, it's got a pretty cool ending sequence here. Eventually, Mega Man takes off his costume, runs back home against the sunset. Now eventually, of course, the creators of Mega Man were vindicated. Capcom grudgingly allowed a sequel to be made, which went on to sell over 1 million copies, and Mega Man eventually, of course, became perhaps Capcom's most prolific franchise. While the first Mega Man game might not be quite as good or well loved as Mega Man 2 or 3, it is still a darned good game. We've reached December 18th, a big day with 7 games released, including a bunch of crap. And Ultraman 2, which is simply unfathomable. Ultraman 2 Shutsugeki Katoku Tai, or Ultraman 2 Special Police Forces Sortie. This FDS game from Bandai is a sequel to the Ultraman game released in January of 1987. Now that was a simple scrolling action game, but this is a bit different. In 1987 we've seen games get much more complex. Everything has to have RPG elements or something. So I guess that's the rationale in this sort of massive genre switch that occurred with this game. Later games went even further afield with various Ultraman RPGs being released. So you start off selecting some options, choosing your equipment, and then it seems you need to stop a monster from destroying the city. Well, there are certainly games that I absolutely failed to get at all, and Ultraman 2 is one of them. You have either a car or a jet you can use to tool around the city in. Both seem absolutely worthless when it comes to monster destroying. You can also run around on foot, very slowly. You have laser guns or missiles or something like that which you can shoot at the monster, but you have limited ammo, about 50 shots. And you can put every single shot into the monster, and then nothing. He just keeps on going. You can even get jets to fly overhead and bomb him, which also doesn't kill him. Eventually he'll march on over to the hospital and level it, and then it's game over. There must be something I'm missing. Power-ups? More ammo? The ability to turn into Ultraman? Some way of actually killing the monster? But I really couldn't figure it out in this game. Ultraman 2 doesn't certainly look very good and exciting. The first game was terrible, so I very much doubt that we're missing much. And it's another old-school favorite from the Nintendo Entertainment System, Karnov, from Data East. While not as popular or successful as Mega Man, Karnov is very much a high-quality action platformer in the classic 8-bit style. Now, Karnov himself has been widely mocked online, mostly because, well, he's a big fat Russian dude with a serious disinclination towards shirts. According to the manual, he's a circus strongman off to retrieve the treasure of Babylon, which was stolen from his village by a dragon. However, I'm going to reveal there's much more to it than that. See, here's the real story of Karnov, from the Japanese version. That's right, the original Japanese release had an introduction and cutscenes with a story and everything. You might sort of think of Karnov as being kind of like a pompous bastard, but here it turns out he was actually sent to the job by God himself. That's right, Karnov is actually a dead guy who gets sent back to Earth as penance for the evil deeds he did while he was alive. Now you know why Karnov always beams down on a lightning bolt and how he's able to shoot fireballs. All of these cutscenes were removed when the game was released in the US, just the title screen was kept. But having the backstory on Karnov makes him a much more sympathetic character. I really sort of see Karnov in a whole new light now. Now originally, of course, Karnov was an arcade game from Data East, released in 1987. In the arcade roundup a few episodes ago, I mistakenly said it was by Nichibutsu. This is clearly one of the many Ghosts and Goblins inspired platformers, which has sort of an Eastern feel to it. Maybe the setting is one of the southern Soviet states like Kyrgyzstan or something like that. Numerous changes were made for the home port, but the basic concept is the same. You travel through several side-scrolling levels and defeat a boss, then move on to the next level, 9 in total. Along the way, there's plenty of helpful items to collect. Bombs, a shield, boots to jump higher, wings that will enable you to fly, and a ladder to help you reach higher areas. Oh yeah, and the cutscenes in between levels, God will actually give you tips. I was never quite sure what to make of this boss. I guess he's supposed to be a guy holding a lion on a leash? Now Karnov is quite adept at jumping and climbing, and he passes through quite a few different types of terrain. There's actually a lot of variety in this game, and while each level is pretty linear, there are often different paths you can take, especially in the later levels. Here, for example, jumping down a shaft will reveal an underground passage full of decay icons. Those icons are sort of like Mario's coins. If you collect enough, you'll get an extra life. You start off with a measly single shot, but collect a couple of power-ups and you'll have 3 streams of rapid-fire shots so they take down most enemies with a quick volley of fireballs. Bosses are much tougher, but the triple shot is still reasonably effective. Unlike in the arcade game, here Karnov can actually take 2 hits before dying. He'll turn a rather distressing shade of green after the first hit, but luckily health refills are pretty common. Now the graphics in Karnov are really nice, and the details in the environments hold a lot of variation. Here's the ice level, for example. It really does give you the feeling of sort of crossing a icy mountain pass. God asks Karnov if he's able to handle swimming the Black Sea. Of course, this is Karnov. He can handle anything. He even brings his little flippers with him. Mario and Alex Kidd made the underwater levels a little tough. Mario had to constantly paddle to keep from sinking, and Alex tended to float, but Karnov can swim underwater just as easily as he were walking on dry ground. And there's lots of caves to explore for power-ups and that sort of thing. While Karnov isn't exactly Metroid, it does make full use both of horizontal and vertical scrolling, more so than most platformers at the time. Here Karnov has to climb over an extremely tall building. At other points he climbs up pyramids, down through underground caverns. Reminds me a bit of Rygar with all the heavy vertical movement. In this particular level, it looks sort of like Karnov's in Greece. While most of the items aren't strictly necessary, some are very helpful. The shield will make certain bosses a lot easier, as it can absorb a few hits. Here's the weirdest, most anachronistic enemy, these bodybuilder guys. Something you do see from time to time in Japanese video games. Cho Aniki, for example. It's funny, Karnov has a bad reputation among some folks on the internet today, but at the time, this was definitely one of the better action games for the system. There are some frustrations. Karnov is easier to control than, say, Simon Belmont, but he still moves a bit sluggishly, and at times the deaths feel unfair, since the hit section borders on absurd at times. Check out this example. Jumping over from fireballs. Whoa! Let's take a closer look at that. Jumping and... there you go. Still, Karnov has enough great moments to make you overlook things like that. Like an entire level that you have to fly through. The flight power-up has a time limit, so you need to keep finding more of those power-ups, which really sort of ratchets up the tension in the level. For the most part though, Karnov is really not that difficult a game, especially if you've got the triple shot. The controls are tight enough where you won't find yourself constantly missing jumps all the time. One thing is, Karnov is not really a very long game. It's much shorter than Rygar, for example, but the fact that many levels contain multiple paths gives you a bit more replay value than your typical platformer. Eventually you'll reach the 9th level and come to the final boss. This is actually a 3-headed dragon. He's a fair boss, you just need to get out of the way of his attacks. He isn't one of those monsters that kills you with all these random, unpredictable attacks. After defeating him in the US version, you get sort of the typical congratulations message. Here there's actually a bona fide ending, with Karnov getting a promotion and the world end up being safe from demons. And by the way, this great English patch is courtesy of Vice Productions. So, Data East, congratulations. You've certainly had a spotty track record with games for the Famicom, but you really pulled this one off. This is a huge improvement over such stuff as Kid Nicky, and definitely the best game Data East has released in the US so far. And this is yet another solid game this episode. This week's winner in the ridiculous name sweepstakes, Stick Hunter. I'm not sure what sort of image that name is supposed to conjure up, but this is an ice hockey game. Exciting ice hockey, as it says here. You would think Konami would have already had that name taken. This game is from K Amusement, the same guys who've released Famicom versions of a few SNK games. And just like the Famicom Ikari and Athena, our good buddies at Micronix are responsible for this. There are some hockey games which have a good reputation, Nintendo's Ice Hockey and Konami's Blades of Steel. Stick Hunter is on a completely different level than those games, a much lower level. Your skaters are heavy and hard to control, penalties are quite easy to get, and it's very simple to beat the computer at the face-off. Once you have the puck, it's best to hang on to it. Passing is a joke in Stick Hunter. Control of your player is handled automatically, but there doesn't seem to be any way to manually switch from one player to the other, and often you'll find yourself wanting to take control of a player that's actually closer to the puck. Sometimes the player under your control is completely off the screen. And of course, as is now the custom, there's a little halftime show. I guess this is reasonably cute. Now aside from all this, the one thing that really drives me crazy about Stick Hunter is that it's pretty much impossible to score a goal. Your shots travel very slowly and the computer's goalie will always block it. I couldn't really find any way of getting a more powerful shot out. Oh yeah, and why is the yellow team not wearing pants? All in all, Stick Hunter is a huge mess. But this is exactly what we've come to expect from Iconics. Sadly, they're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. Oh man, that's some frenetic opening music. Taito Grand Prix, Echo Heno License, a racing game from, well, it's from Taito as a matter of fact. I'm going to guess the subtitle means License to Glory. A lot of options on the menu screen lead us to believe this will not be your usual racing game. You need to enter your name and all that. And then, well, it's Dragon Quest on wheels. Well, maybe not exactly, but not too far off either. I guess Taito Grand Prix is the closest to a driving RPG we've seen. I suppose it's really the first console game with a career mode. You drive around from city to city, each city having a series of races you need to win. Aside from entering races, there's a shop in each city where you can buy upgrades to your vehicle, and a sort of status screen where you can customize your car. What's this? Customize your car in 1987? Yes, Taito Grand Prix has a lot of features that are now standard in modern racing games. Switching out parts is one of them. So you start up at the bottom. You can only enter the Class D races. Select a race and then off you go. The races are timed trials, not real races against other drivers. Clearly, Outrun is the major influence here, right down to the banner that stretches across the starting line. I guess attendance at the Taito Grand Prix is sort of down, only 4 people showed up for the start of the race. This handles a lot like any other Outrun style game, Rad Racer for example. There's 3 gears, you'll need to usually manually upshift using the D-pad. There's one checkpoint in the middle of the track. If you manage to beat the timer, you'll be awarded some money. One of the things you can do with the money is, of course, buy new parts. You need to drive from city to city to compete in more races. Each city also has different shops. There's a little variety in the tracks. Here's the obligatory nighttime course, for example. Now try doing that stunt in Forza Motorsports. Your vehicle, incidentally, seems to be a Mini Cooper. There's a lot of stuff you can buy. Brakes, tires, suspensions, nitro, spoilers, much like a modern racing game. I suppose the appeal of Taito Grand Prix is sort of similar to that of RPGs. Your car starts off lame, slow, handles bad, but through persistence and hard work, you can eventually get improvements to your car stats. Some of the other racing games we've seen have sort of toyed with this idea, but this is the first to really go all the way. Taito simply said, screw it, we'll give you a crappy car, win races and you can level up. Then you'll have your dream machine. Here's another sort of very Outrun themed level, going by the ocean with little boats in the background. Now eventually acquire enough points and you'll make it to level C. You can now compete in the C ranked races, which are a little tougher. I guess the Taito Grand Prix car customization system was a little bit ahead of its time, but this makes perfect sense considering how RPGs are influencing so many genres in 1987. The game does have some aesthetic issues. It's a little ugly, the tracks are sort of repetitive, but what do you expect? There's a lot more races than your typical driving game of the time. Now there is a non-career mode on this as well. You can select from the start menu just sort of like a standard driving mode, and this is done either with a Ferrari or a Formula 1. Unlike the Mini Cooper, these are high-performance cars and handle very well. So overall this game is generally pretty cool. It's funny, why do Famicom racing games never seem to come out in the US? Other than Rad Racer, most of the racers we've seen have had sort of Japan-only releases. It's very strange, and you know, we've actually got a couple more next episode. Let's take a little look at another quickie FDS game from Sunsoft. This time we have Nazoler Land Special, Quiz Owo Akusa or Quiz Owo Sagasa. There seems to be some disagreement as how to transliterate the title. Apparently that means find out Quizmasters. Well, this is the third Nazoler Land disc from Sunsoft. For those of you with good memories, the first two were little compilation discs with various simple games. This special disc is simply a quiz game. A quiz game is something we'll encounter a lot of in Japanese gaming. We also have quiz games here in the US, but it seems like they're things you more find at bars rather than on home consoles. This game is pretty bare bones, just questions and answers. Nothing's been done to dress it up at all. I think Sunsoft will go down in history as perhaps the inventor of shovelware on the consoles. As we hear the first notes of Uematsu's famous score, we have at last reached the big game this episode. Final Fantasy, first game in Square's RPG franchise that transformed the company from a small producer of computer and FTS games to one of the biggest video game companies in the world. There were tons of 8-bit RPGs, but Final Fantasy, along with Phantasy Star, are the ones that are most well loved here in the West. The basic plot setup is given in the introductory text, but the title screen doesn't appear quite yet. Final Fantasy, while falling into the general category of a Dragon Quest clone, also borrows a lot from Western RPGs, such as Ultima 3. This is pretty obvious right here. You begin by choosing your party from 6 different character classes: Fighter, Thief, Black Belt, Red Mage, White Mage, and Black Mage. Unlike Dragon Quest 2 or Phantasy Star, your characters are complete ciphers with no dialogue or characterization. In this case I've gone with a Fighter, Thief for physical attacks, White Mage for healing, and Black Mage for magical attacks. So you start off on the overworld, in front of the castle. Entering the castle, you can talk to various castle folk who wonder if you're the fabled Light Warriors. You will also find the king who asks you to rescue his daughter, the princess. You will also find some treasure chests, but also locked rooms that require a special key, of course. So, head out into the town and find the usual NPCs, shops, and the inn. You start with some money, but no equipment or spells, so first thing is to buy some stuff. And yes, Final Fantasy does make you pay for spells. Your mages need to buy each spell at the white and black magic shops. Heal and fire are good starter spells. Now, different classes can equip only certain weapons. As a rule, heavy armor and swords are used for the physical attackers, and weak armor, daggers, wands, and hammers for the magic users. You'll need to check the manual to figure out who can equip what. The game itself won't tell you. Final Fantasy's menu screens are pretty good. It's pretty simple to trade items and to equip them. All your characters are found on one screen. You don't have to switch back and forth to equip stuff on every single character. Now once you've taken care of all that, it's time to head out onto the overworld, which has the typical Dragon Quest layout. Now, the one area in which Final Fantasy makes a huge jump over Dragon Quest is the combat. Rather than the typical first-person view, Final Fantasy lays out everything sideways. Each party member can select a specific monster to attack. This allows you to battle much more strategically. For example, by having the strong fighters attack separate monsters and having weaker members gang up on one particular monster. This will allow you to take out monsters one by one if you want to. One of the big frustrations of combat in Phantasy Star was that members would attack random monsters. You can also organize your party members with the strongest on top. The members on top are more likely to take hits, so you can protect your mages a little bit by keeping them down towards the bottom. Still, keeping your mages alive is going to be sort of one of the more difficult things early on in the game. The whole rescue the princess plot has already become sort of a cliché in fantasy games by this point. Final Fantasy subverts the whole thing by having you rescue the princess first thing. And the first boss of the game, Garland, is encountered immediately. I'm actually going to start fighting him at level 2 here. He's almost like an entire little mini RPG before the game really starts. Luckily, Garland is pretty easy, so you don't really have to do too much leveling before you take him on. Now once you've rescued the princess, the Grateful King builds a bridge, and then the real game starts. The delayed title screen must have been quite surprising the first time anyone played this game, but it does serve to sort of increase the feeling of epic scope to the game, like wow, I've been playing for a half hour and the real game's just now starting. So let's talk a little bit about Final Fantasy's history. Probably the most repeated video game related tale on the internet is that of Square's teetering on the edge of bankruptcy after the non-success of the DOG label. Sakaguchi decided to give video games one last try, a fantasy game called Final Fantasy, either because Square would collapse financially after this game, or alternately, Sakaguchi was going to quit video games if it wasn't a success. Lo and behold, Final Fantasy was a huge hit, Square became the premier maker of console RPGs, and Final Fantasy became the biggest RPG series ever, and I guess all this could be true, I suppose. Now it's interesting, Square had actually planned an earlier, gigantic RPG for the Famicom disk system, Seiken Densetsu, The Emergence of Excalibur. The game was advertised, but never actually created. Final Fantasy sort of filled the hole caused by that game's cancellation. As for Final Fantasy's success, well, it did do pretty well. Reportedly, the original release sold about 400,000 copies. Pretty solid. What about the earlier games from the Final Fantasy team? 3D World Runner supposedly sold 500,000 copies, and Rad Racer? Almost 2 million copies. Say what? I thought all of Square's earlier titles had been flops. Final Fantasy wasn't even their best-selling title? Of course, Square didn't release the US versions themselves, so presumably it was the Japanese release of Final Fantasy that brought in so much needed cash. While Final Fantasy is popular in the US, it's virtually a state religion in Japan. Consider this, in 2006, Famitsu, the biggest Japanese gaming magazine, polled its readers on the best games of all time. Final Fantasy placed 4 games in the top 10, with Final Fantasy X and 7 taking top honors. Dragon Quest was right behind, with 3 titles. It's amazing the way these 2 games dominate Japanese gamers' hearts. Now, what about the other 3? Well, there was Machi, a visual novel for the PlayStation, Tactics Ogre, sort of a surprise choice, and Ocarina of Time. The Famitsu list is quite odd in many ways, and we'll actually come back to it a little bit later. Well, Final Fantasy was remade and republished quite a few times. Maybe the most well-known is the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy Origins. Maybe it's the best way to play the game for those allergic to 8-bit graphics. And a severely neutered version was released for the Game Boy Advance as Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls. Well, going back to the game itself, after some wandering around, much like in Dragon Quest II, you say, hey, I'm just sort of stuck on a big island. Luckily, you'll encounter some wussy pirates and take their ship, just like in Ultima 3. Sure, 9 pirates look like a lot, but these guys are big wusses. Special sea monsters will appear in the random battles when you're traveling on the oceans. Now, of course, you can sort of explore around, find some new towns and cities, that sort of thing. Final Fantasy tries to create a more vibrant living world than that of Dragon Quest. Instead of just sort of like the typical towns you encounter, there's actually a lot of stuff. There's an underground city of dwarves, a witch's cave, a city of elves, a dragon king, all of which will assist you if you perform some task for them. Oh yeah, and remember this guy. There's a sort of somewhat complicated interlocking series of side quests involving finding a witch's eye, awakening an elf king who is put to sleep with a curse, this dude who wants a crown hidden in a cave, and a dwarf who needs TNT. Now this next cave is probably the first truly challenging part of the game, where you'll encounter group after group of tough monsters, which frequently like to put sort of bad status effects on your party. The undead creatures tend to paralyze you. Fortunately, your mage's magic are pretty effective against zombies and that sort of thing. On the other hand, your magic is very limited. Other RPGs use status effects, but Final Fantasy really goes whole hog. You can be blinded, put to sleep, silenced, paralyzed, poisoned, and worst of all, turned to stone. Both poison and stone are permanent status effects until your character is cured. Poison in particular tends to happen a lot near the beginning of the game. You have potions to cure poison, but if you run out while you're in a dungeon, you're in trouble, and if your poison party member dies, you'll need to fight your way back through the dungeon, across the overworld, and into town. And unlike Phantasy Star, there are no items to instantly transport you back to town. So Final Fantasy is quite brutal, and not always fair. Here you see 3 of my party members have been poisoned. Not an uncommon occurrence in this game. Eventually you'll come across magic that will cure poison, but not yet. The bottom line is, buy a lot of poison antidotes before heading into a dungeon. After obtaining the herb to wake up the Elf King, he'll give you the magic key. Now this is sort of one of those truly rewarding moments in Final Fantasy, as you can now go back to all the previous caves and castles and open up all those locked doors and get mad loot and fantastic weapon and armor upgrades. So Final Fantasy sort of runs hot and cold. When it's not being sadistically cruel, it can be very generous. You'll definitely want to head back to the Dwarf Cave and go into this locked room. And get some brand spanking new armor. Now, the one area in which Final Fantasy really excels is in the character and monster design. Now sure, most monsters are taken directly out of Dungeons & Dragons, but the art goes well beyond your typical RPG skeletons and slimes. This is probably due a lot to the work of Yoshitaka Amano. Really, he took video game illustration to a whole new level. Like Toriyama's work on Dragon Quest was great, but still it's in a rather simple comic book style. If you take a look at the covers that Amano did, they're all really fantastic. He brought a high level of craft to his work. His very fluid drawing style more resembles some of those great illustrators of the early 20th century, rather than a comic book artist. Now, Final Fantasy has sort of a gooey New Age plot that involves 4 mystic orbs that you have to rescue from 4 fiends, who are destroying the harmony of the universe or something like that. It's perhaps a more ambitious storyline than your typical kill the evil wizard thing found in most RPGs. Here's the very first fiend, the Lich, the fiend of the earth. After him, you'll need to take on the fiends of fire, water, and air. So from here on out, you're sort of out there exploring the world, leveling up, buying better armor and magic, which can actually get quite expensive. Actually, everything's kind of expensive in Final Fantasy. Even the basic heal potions are like 60 gold each. Even worse, the soft potions, the one that cure stone, are like 800 gold each. And the higher levels of magic are outrageously expensive. Here only on level 6, and everything costs 20,000 gold. Now after this point, you'll obtain a canoe, which will allow you to travel on rivers, which will allow you to find the volcano where the Fire Fiend lives. Again, once you're inside the volcano, the game ratchets up the difficulty quite a bit, as the volcano is huge, hard to navigate, and large sections of the floor are covered by lava, which causes damage at each step. Sure, there was a little bit of this in Dragon Quest II, but not nearly to the extent of this game. Difficult enemies will often be encountered when you open chests, such as these things, the elements. Here's the fire element. These are kind of like a recurring theme in the Final Fantasy games. Now, another level to Final Fantasy's combat system is the elemental properties of magic. Many monsters are weak to a particular kind of magic spell. Fire monsters take damage from ice spells, undead creatures take damage from fire, sea creatures from lightning. A vastly more complex magic system is one of the ways in which Final Fantasy improves on its predecessors. Dragon Quest had 13 spells, Phantasy Star had 18, Final Fantasy has 64. Of every variety, damage, support, spells to inflict statuses on enemies, spells to speed up your characters. By far the most intensive use of magic in a video game RPG we've seen so far. Though the magic system is quite odd, you have a limited number of charges for each level of magic, and there's a total of 8 levels. You get more charges as you level up, but with all the early Japanese RPGs, you never really seem to have enough magic, especially healing magic. It is extremely easy to run out of useful spells in the middle of a dungeon. Now after finding the canoe, the game's next major breakthrough occurs here, when you find the greatest piece of transportation in RPG history, the airship. Yes, you can now fly anywhere in the world with no encounters. Again, this is one of the great moments in the game. Suddenly you have all this freedom of movement, places that appear on the map are now reachable. And yes, Final Fantasy actually does come with an in-game map. That's one of those features that makes, say, finally, an RPG with a map. It's great to be able to play an RPG and finally know where exactly you are. With the airship you can suddenly start exploring around, and you'll come across these islands. To get another awesome surprise, you go inside and you'll find an underground city of dragons. Now aside from some treasure chests, you'll find the king of dragons himself, Bahamut. Technically speaking, Bahamut is a giant sea creature, or a fish, the Arabic equivalent of behemoth. But D&D turned him into a dragon, so here he is, as a dragon. He's a fellow that would keep turning up in Final Fantasy games, usually as a summon. Now Bahamut wants you to prove your courage to him, so you have to find this thing called the Rat Tail, hidden inside the Castle of Ordeals. Now once you've done this, you can return to him, and he will grant you a class change. Mages will become wizards, fighters become knights, and so on. You can now learn more spells and equip better weapons and armor. The thief in particular becomes much more useful after being upgraded to a ninja. He's suddenly able to equip decent armor. It's a real pleasure to watch your defense and attack stats suddenly shoot up. One problem is the mages don't look quite as cute anymore. Yeah, finally I can put all the silver armor on my ninja. Now the Fiend of Fire is Carrie. Well, that's yet another mangling of the name Kali. I suppose it's better than Curly in Magic of Scheherazade. The bosses can be tough, capable of dishing out huge damage. When facing some of these guys, defensive magic is really where it's at. A fire will protect you from her fire attacks. Also, the fast spell will allow your knight to double the number of hits he has per attack. These boss fights are not simply about hitting attack over and over again, you really need to make intelligent use of your magic. In Dragon Quest II and Phantasy Star, the boss battles were mostly just about hitting the enemy with the strongest attacks you have, but here you sort of have to know specific techniques in order to defeat the bosses easily. Now after the Fire Fiend, you'll need to go to an underwater temple, but first of all you actually have to buy an extremely expensive bottle containing a fairy that'll allow you to breathe underwater. Yeah, 50,000 gold. It's kind of like the passport in Phantasy Star. Then you get to travel by submarine to the lair of the Water Fiend. Now at some point, Final Fantasy does become a bit easier going, and the Water Temple is not as tough as the Earth or the Volcano in my opinion. I think for me the turning point was finding the Heal Staff and the Zeus Gauntlet. These are magical items that allow you to cast Heal and Thunder every battle. Your mage's magic is so limited in quantity that you have to use it really sparingly, and being able to cast magic spells at no cost in magical points made a huge difference. The fact also that I now have decent armor for the ninja and wizards is also helpful. They're not almost always on the verge of death. Though of course, as you saw a second ago, one-hit kills are still not that uncommon. All the Final Fantasy games seem to have some science fiction themes, this one included. You'll encounter a town populated by a once technologically advanced people. They'll direct you to the Floating Sky Castle, a product of lost technology, essentially a space station. Here you'll encounter Tiamat the Air Fiend, as well as tons of chests filled with armor and weapons and upgrades. Now one thing you can find is the metal that you need to go back to that dwarf and create Excalibur, the second most powerful sword in the game. The most powerful being Masamune. These two swords appear over and over again in Final Fantasy games, usually as the best weapons. Another recurring feature of Final Fantasy found here, the secret super tough boss. Here it's this guy called Warmeg, who when he attacks with nuclear dishes out a total of 643 points of damage in one turn. Beating this guy is more a matter of luck than anything. Now after you've collected all the 4 orbs, it turns out there's another evil force behind the whole thing. You'll need to head back to the very first dungeon, and travel back 2,000 years in time, and face Garland, who's created some kind of like crazy time loop. The true final boss is Chaos, which is sort of Garland combined with the powers of the 4 fiends. Pretty tough, but not as bad as Warmech. While fighting him, he will dish out quite a bit of damage, but once you defeated Chaos, well then congratulations, you've beaten the game. Well, Final Fantasy was quite an accomplishment for Square. Technically a Dragon Quest clone, but one that makes huge improvements to the Dragon Quest formula. Better use of magic, much more stuff to find. Final Fantasy has a total of 40 weapons. Dragon Quest II had 18, I believe. A combat system with more depth, and much more player freedom due to the different character classes in a customizable party. Of course, this does sacrifice any sort of characterization on the part of your characters, however. And the game does randomly throw down some unfair moments at you. Nothing like having your entire party paralyzed and then watching the monsters tear them to shreds, and naturally quite a bit of grinding is involved in spots. And there are some programming bugs, and certain spells don't work as they should. But considering Square's history, the fact they could make an RPG of this caliber is pretty amazing. The success of Final Fantasy caused Square to sort of switch directions. Instead of making games like Rad Racer, they now made a lot of RPGs. They went to work on a sequel to Final Fantasy pretty quickly. It would actually come out next year in 1988. Final Fantasy would become one of the biggest selling franchises in video game history. I believe it's currently the 5th biggest selling video game franchise of all time. Today, Final Fantasy is still a game worth playing. Maybe one thing you won't quite grasp from this video is how brutally difficult the game can be in spots. Unlike Phantasy Star, there's a real feeling of tension in Final Fantasy, especially when you're in the dungeons. I mean, you feel like your entire party could be killed at any given time, which of course is true, it can. Well, regardless of the difficulty, Final Fantasy is really the most impressive RPG we've seen for the Famicom so far, and sort of an indication as the direction that RPGs would eventually be going. Alright, now let's move on to the what the hell category, with a little game we call Mezase Pachi Pro, Pachio-kun. The title could be translated as to be a Pachi Pro, or that is a professional pachinko player, and it's quite a goal. This is the first Famicom game from the horribly named company Coconuts Japan. Coconuts, now defunct, specialize in sports and gambling titles, and this is the first game to feature Pachio-kun, who becomes sort of Coconut's mascot. There were a surprising number of Pachio-kun games, more than there should have been, with the utterly bizarre American Dream being the most well-known over here. Mezase Pachio Pro is a pachinko game, but not just any pachinko game. No, your goal as Pachio-kun is to beat every pachinko machine in the parlor. For those who aren't familiar with pachinko, it's sort of one of Japan's major bad habits. It involves shooting little ball bearings into a pachinko machine. The machine will keep the ball bearings unless the ball lands in the right slot, and then you win more ball bearings. The goal is to come out with more ball bearings than you went in with. Pachinko is not officially gambling, so you can't redeem the ball bearings for cash, except that in reality, you can. So all you need to do to play in this game is to step to a machine and start playing pachinko. For some reason, the idea of a giant living pachinko ball trying to win normal-sized pachinko balls is a little odd to me. To beat a machine, you need to empty out all the balls. This might take a while. Good luck. The D-pad controls the pressure with which the balls are sent out, and the button shoots one ball. You can also inspect the pins on the machine closely, though I'm not really sure how that's going to help you. Is there actually some sort of art to playing pachinko? Presumably. One interesting thing about the Pachio-kun games, according to Game Developer Research Institute, they were developed by Marionette, who we've already encountered. They've done some games for Pony Canyon, like Dr. Chaos. But the name Sea Dream appears on the title screens. Who exactly were Sea Dream? I wish I knew. However, some folks, perhaps noting the game's poor quality, have connected Color Dreams to the Pachio-kun titles. For example, both the Wikipedia article on American Dream and GameFAQs lists Color Dreams as the developer. But Color Dreams, a US-based company, was not formed until either 1988 or 1989, and there's absolutely no reason to believe they would be doing development work for Coconuts, even if they were around in 1987. So the similarity in names is just a coincidence. Well, the game seems ridiculous to me, but if you love pachinko, then hey, go ahead and check it out. As promised, let's go back to that crazy top 100 games of all time list, as voted by the readers of Famitsu. The list is generally strange to any Western game fan, but might give us a bit of insight into the mindset of the typical Japanese committed gamer. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest dominate the list, but even those games' placement is a bit odd from our perspective. Dragon Quest V seems to be the most highly regarded of the 2D Dragon Quest games, despite not even being released over here until recently. Yet it doesn't even quite make the top 10, being beaten by Dragon Quest III, and amazingly Dragon Quest VII, a game that is considered to be kind of boring and poorly designed in the West. And if you ask anyone you know what the best 2D Final Fantasy game is, well, 9 out of 10 will say Final Fantasy VI. It is an undisputed masterpiece of 16-bit RPGs, but it comes in here at number 25, well below Final Fantasy IV and V, the other two Super Famicom Final Fantasies. And incredibly, despite the fact that the Japanese love Square and RPGs, the game which here we consider to be sort of the pinnacle of the Japanese RPG and one of the best 16-bit games of all time, Chrono Trigger, turns up at number 26. That's only 4 spots above Final Fantasy X2. Seriously? Looking at the list, Square Enix and Nintendo completely dominate. But what about the other companies? The big names are all there, but not for the games you might expect. Sega? Oh yeah, those are the guys who make those dating sims, and Virtua Fighter, though Sonic the Hedgehog does barely make the top 50 at number 49. A lot of the Sega games that might make a similar list here in the United States, such as the Shining Force games or the Panzer Dragoon games, Phantasy Star, Shenmue, those sorts of things, all missing. Capcom is not exactly really well represented. Mostly it's on here for Street Fighter II and the Resident Evil games. Konami does a little bit better with Tomeki Memorial and the Metal Gear titles making showings. Still, Metal Gear Solid, a game with a huge reputation in the US as perhaps the best PlayStation game, shows up at number 50. Even crazier, Metal Gear Solid 2 is number 42. Yes, apparently Japan likes Metal Gear Solid 2 better than Metal Gear Solid. What's missing from the list? Well, not surprisingly, Western developed games are almost entirely absent, so there's no first-person shooters, no real-time strategy games or adventure games, or even modern Western RPGs. So forget about Half-Life and Civilization, Baldur's Gate and all that. Not even GoldenEye or Donkey Kong Country makes the list. The ones that do are Grand Theft Auto Vice City at number 76, SimCity at 93, and, believe it or not, Wizardry at number 66. I suppose the absence of Western games is understandable, but what about certain classic Japanese games? There are some choices here that are sort of baffling. Mega Man? Nowhere to be found. Castlevania? Nope. Not even Symphony of the Night. Another game you'd think would be on the best PlayStation game ever shortlist. Metroid? No. Super Metroid, the greatest ever Super Nintendo title? Well, no, it's not here. Soul Calibur, Ninja Gaiden, Contra, Star Fox? Nope, none of those. Another guy who fares worse than you might think is, believe it or not, Mario. Super Mario Bros. Place is very high, and Super Mario World is here, but Super Mario 3, believe it or not, it's at number 99 on the list. Missing is Super Mario 64, and weirdly, Super Mario RPG. The Japanese seem to love Square Nintendo, but together, I guess not. None of the later regular Mario games, or any of the Mario RPG games make the list. Well, to make this all relevant to Chrontendo, here are the Famicom games that actually made the list. The console did pretty well, 18 titles out of 100. Both Dragon Quest III and Final Fantasy make the top 10. Then in the next 10 we have Dragon Quest II, certainly not a bad game, and Super Mario Bros. Coming in at number 21, and the original Dragon Quest a little bit lower, down at number 30. Then, kind of strangely, Mother, that's sort of known to us as Earthbound Zero, Nintendo's RPG at number 38, Legend of Zelda, a mere 46. Then some oddities, Digital Devil Story, Megami Tensei 2 makes the list. Right below that is Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy I at number 63. It's odd that in Japan they seem to like Final Fantasy II better than the first one. A little bit later we have Pro Yaku Family Stadium, that's Namco's baseball game, known as RBI Baseball in the West. Wizardry, oddly enough. Hokkaido Renza Satsujin, that's the Enix-developed adventure game we saw a few episodes ago. Best Play Pro Yaku, a baseball game from ASCII. Kung Fu, believe it or not, that's the Spartan X game. Pro Yaku Family Stadium 87, Gradius, and Super Mario Bros. 3. Yes, Kung Fu is apparently a better game than Super Mario Bros. 3. Obviously, taste is all relative, but try figuring that one out. So what does all this mean? Well, I guess it means we've actually got another top 100 game coming up next. Well, we've reached our final game today, and it's a port of one of the original RPGs, Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, released by ASCII in Japan and Nexoft in the US. It's a pretty fancy title screen here. The original game was by Andrew Greenberg and Robert Woodhead, first published by Woodhead's company, Surtech, in 1981. Wizardry was possibly the first Surtech game. They continued to exist and release games until the late 90s, I think. Well, Wizardry is very much an old school RPG, literally one of the first video game RPGs created. As such, it's based heavily on Dungeons & Dragons. You need to create your party before you can go anywhere. Unlike most Japanese RPGs, you need to abide by the D&D rules, such as choosing a race, alignment, assigning bonus points, and so on. The classes are quite similar to those in Final Fantasy. You have your fighters, mages, thieves, and so on. Wizardry, along with Ultima, was one of the American RPGs that inspired such games as Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, though obviously many of the elements in these games were simplified when designing console RPGs for the Famicom. So what we have here is pretty much undiluted Wizardry. Very little was changed for this port, so you're getting pretty much the full, unpleasant, antique RPG experience. While there are shops, an inn, a church, and so on, modern gamers might be horrified to find that these exist in a text-based menu only. There's no sort of graphical depiction of anything outside the dungeon. There's no NPCs, dialogue, characterization, or really any of that, just straight dungeon crawling. So once you got your party together, you head off into the maze, as Wizardry calls it, and start slaying monsters and exploring. Oh yeah, and there's a genuinely slimy-looking slime, not like one of those cute little blobs from Dragon Quest. It's a very unmarketable slime. And yes, every single treasure chest that you get is possibly booby-trapped. You can attempt to disarm the trap, but there is a high chance of getting some sort of debilitating status ailment every single time you open a chest. Now, Wizardry has been released and ported countless times. The very first version was the 1981 Apple II release, a horribly ugly game, I might add. It was released in this slightly better-looking version for DOS in 1984. Shortly afterwards, there was a Commodore 64 release, a Macintosh release. Wizardry came to Japanese computers as well. Here, for example, is the MX2 port. And of course, we got the Famicom game as well. All these older releases had wireframe maze walls, but the Famicom version was ported by Game Studio and used deep dungeon-style solid walls. However, One interesting thing, there actually is a menu option in the Famicom version to switch to the wireframe walls if you wanted a real sort of old-fashioned authentic wizardry experience. You can even turn off such modern frivolities such as music and sound effects. Here's the option screen right here. Now really all of these versions that we've seen are virtually identical, other than the graphics department. Eventually reworked and more modernized versions were published for the PC Engine, the Saturn, the PlayStation, and so on. The game has really been around a number of times. Now the Famicom version, as I mentioned, was ported by Game Studio. That was Masanobu Indu's company. He's the guy who was behind Xevious and Tower of Druaga. While Wizardry was one of the most renowned computer RPGs back in the early 80s, by the end of the decade it had sort of lost its luster in the US. You might recall we saw Wizardry 4 for the Apple II a couple episodes back in the 1987 PC Game Roundup. Remember how dated that game was? The series stopped being cutting edge pretty quickly into its lifespan. The last, what you would call regular Wizardry game from Surtech was Wizardry 8 in 2001. But in Japan, the series took on a life of its own with various spin-offs like the Game Boy Wizardry Gaiden games or the Wizardry Empire series. A lot of publishers have been involved. ASCII, Capcom, Starfish. The most recent was a DS title that came out, well, I guess a couple weeks ago in Japan. Here, for example, is one such Japanese title, Wizardry Summoner, for the Game Boy Advance. It was published by Media Rings. Perhaps the most notorious game that they ever published was Toilet Kids for the PC Engine. I'm not sure why this series changed hands so many times. As you recall, Wizardry made the Famitsu Reader's Top 100 list, beating Super Mario 3. So clearly they really love this game in Japan. If you try playing it today, well, who knows if you'll like it. It can be infuriating as heck. It's easy to get killed and way too expensive to revive or heal party characters. Staying in an inn, for example, cost 10 gold pieces per hit point, per character. Curing character of poison cost 100 gold. Considering how little money you rake in killing monsters, this is utterly ridiculous. The game is not huge, 10 floors, and your character can only go to level 7, but there are lots of spells, tons of armor and weapons. I can't really say I recommend this game. 99% of RPG fans today would consider it to be sort of dull and repetitive and unbalanced, but for those interested in very early RPG history, I guess you might give it a go. Wow, what a huge episode. We've reached December 22nd, but we've still got 7 more games left in 1987, and then next episode will begin the brand new year of 1988. Also next episode we do have one very special game from Konami, the game in fact that kicked off Konami's greatest video game series. So I hope to see you then.